Welcome to this WiseOwl tutorial on linking to SQL Server within Python. Here's what you'll learn during the tutorial. So we'll begin with a quick warning about Pandas. If you already use Pandas and data frames, there's much easier ways to load SQL Server data into them than the instructions contained in this tutorial. So this is for people who aren't using Pandas. So firstly, we'll learn how to install your example database of 10 films. Then I'll show you how you can connect to SQL Server in Python using the PyODBC module. We'll look at how you can fetch rows, 3 different ways to do that. We'll look at how you can run action queries to insert, update, or delete data. And finally, we'll look at how you can run stored procedures, passing parameters to them if necessary. At the top right of your screen about now, you should see a link appearing as always, and you can click on that to get at any of the files referred to or used during this tutorial, and any exercises if there are any. And if that link isn't available, you can always click on the link on the YouTube homepage for this tutorial. But that's enough of me. I think I'm going to vanish and hand control to Sven, who'll guide you through the rest of the tutorial as ever. So let's get started. So before you devote a chunk of your life to watching this excellent tutorial on linking SQL Server and Python, just a quick warning on whether you're using pandas and data frames. What I'm going to do is show you how to loop down a set of rows. So we'll create a cursor to go to the first row in a table, and then it will go to the second row and the third row, and it will loop down the rows doing something to each in turn. Now that's great, but if you're working with pandas data frames, you'll want to create something like this. And you can do it with a single command in pandas by transferring the information from a SQL Server table into a pandas data frame. So I think my advice would be, if you've absolutely no idea what I'm talking about and think a panda is a black and white bear living in China, then ignore what I've just said and carry on and enjoy the rest of this tutorial. But if you're already working with pandas, I wouldn't watch the rest of this tutorial, and I would wait for the next dedicated tutorial on pandas coming up in this series. So before we can link to a database, we need a database to link to. And what I'm going to do now is show you how to set up the example we're going to use in the rest of this tutorial. Obviously, you can easily use your own database instead, in which case you could skip this part. So I'm in SQL Server Management Studio. What I can do is open up a file. In fact, I've got mine in my recent files list, but otherwise I could have chosen Open and then chosen File. So I'm going to choose to open the file called Creating Movies Database.sql, which is an accompaniment to this tutorial. And what I can now do is to execute this by pressing F5 or clicking on the Execute button. And what it will do is generate a database and a table and show the results of it. So you can see if I right-click and refresh my list of databases, there's a movies database. And if I look at the list of tables within that, there's one called TBL Film, and it contains those columns. So that's generated my database. What I can now do is show how to link to it in Python. So what I want to do is to create a program which will link to my table of films and print them all out. So the first thing I need to check is whether I have the module installed to do this. So I'm going to open up a new copy of a terminal window. And in this, I'll run pip space list to see what modules I've got installed. And unfortunately, I haven't got PyODBC, which is the one I need. So I'll run pip install and then PyODBC. ODBC stands for Open Database Connectivity if you want to show off in a pub quiz. And that will install the necessary module, or at least it would if I could put the right number of L's in install. So now that I've got that available to me, I can import it. It's ready for use. And the rest of this is really just a question of getting the commands working once, and then whenever you want to use them again, you can just copy and paste. There are many, many different ways to run these commands in different orders, but they all do exactly the same thing in just different permutations. So the very first thing I need to do is I need to create a connection. So I'll call it CN, and to do that, I'll type pyodbc.connect, and then in brackets specify the connection string. Now I'm going to cheat, And the reason I'm going to cheat is because I don't want to spend the rest of this tutorial discussing connection strings. It's a huge topic. I'm sure you'll all have your own connection strings already set up, and I really don't want to get into it. Here I'm using a trusted connection, so I'm using, rather than using SQL Server authentication, I'm using Windows authentication. And I'm connecting to a database called Movies in an instance called SQL 2019 on my current computer. So hopefully that will all work. What I'm next going to do is set up my query. To do that, I'll create a variable. Let's call it QRY and keep my variable name short for now. And although it's not case sensitive, I'm going to type it in upper and lowercase combined. So I'll select all the records from the table of films. And just to show you don't have to do a plain vanilla select, I'll do some ordering by. I'll order them by the film title. And just commented. Let's add a comment here saying create a connection to SQL Server database. So the next thing I need to do is to create something called a cursor. And a cursor is what allows you to go line by line or row by row through the records. To do this, I create, let's call it CSR. And what I can do is use the connection I've created called CN and apply the cursor method to it. Now that I've got a cursor, I can execute it against the query to basically get a load of records back. I'm typing in the comment execute a cursor. I'm not entirely sure I know exactly what it does, but I know it works and that's all I care about. So to do this, I can type csr.execute, and then in brackets, I can specify my SQL query. And then the only other thing I need to do after this is to fetch the records. Now I'll talk more about the various permutations for fetching records in the next part of this tutorial, but for the moment, let's just fetch them all. So I put fetch all, and I can do that by creating a variable. I'll call it films. And I'll put csr.fetchAll, and that's a method, so I need to put an open and close brackets after it. I'll test if this works. To do that, I'll just print out the films. It won't look very pretty, but it will at least prove I've actually talked to the database. And the final thing I need to do is very important. I need to close the connection because I've left it open, and it's a very bad idea to leave connections to databases open. And the way you do that is to type cn.close, which won't surprise anybody. I think that's going to work. So let's give it a go. I'll try running my program. And you can see it gives me, it looks to me like I've got a list of rows, and each row is a tuple. If I could just highlight that one. That's one row as a tuple, and I've got a list of different rows. So that's the basics of connecting to SQL Server. Now you've got this code set up and running, you can copy it and use it anywhere, and it should always link to the SQL query that you want it to. I've created another file called fetchingrows.py and copied all of the code from the previous one up to the point at which I was fetching all the records. And because I'm a bit scared I'm going to forget to close the connection, let's just add that in at the end. Between this, I can fetch one record at a time, or fetch a lot of records, a bucket, or fetch all of them. The different ways of fetching rows are shown in this picture called fetchmethods.png. The three ways: you can either fetch a single row at a time, and the advantage of this is once you've reached the row you want, you can stop. You can fetch a chunk of rows, or you can fetch every single row. Provided you haven't got too many rows, that might be the easiest option, which is the one we did to begin with. So let's look at fetch many and then fetch one. So the first thing we're going to do is fetch, let's say, 5 rows. I've chosen that number completely arbitrarily. So to do this, I could create a variable called films to take the cursor and fetch the first 5 rows. I'm curious to know what sort of a thing I've got. If you let your mouse linger over fetch many, you'll see it returns something of type list row. So you may think it looks strongly typed, but as we'll find out, it's not. And when you type the dot in, the IntelliSense won't really help you. So I haven't got a set of rows. I can loop over these rows, listing them out. To do that, I can use the standard construction for film in films. I'm going to print out the details of this film. So I'll print a message saying, I think I'll start with the title of the film, which I'll substitute in for that placeholder. And I'll put was made in, and then I'll put the release year as a second. I need to then provide those two bits of details. So for the first one, film is a reference to the entire row, and I need to get to the title. But unfortunately, there's nothing telling me that that's what the field is called. I'm just doing that from memory. And likewise, for the when it was released, I know it was called released, but again, I'm having to do that from memory. So if I now try running that program, you should see it gives me the first 5 films. So fetch many is great when you don't want to, maybe you want to testing it out, maybe you just want to try a few rows as a proof of concept before you download the entire database. You'll be friends with your IT department if you use fetch many. The alternative to fetch many, which I promised would cover, as I just comment all that out, is to fetch one row at a time. So with this, what we're going to do is loop while a condition is true. We're going to keep trying to get the next record. So I'm going to create a variable called film row, and I'm going to set it to be the next film. So I'll use fetch1 on this occasion. And that may or may not work. To find out if it worked, what I'm going to do is put in an if condition to see if it actually returned anything. Because when I get to the end of the set of films, it won't. And to do that, I can say if it doesn't exist. And if that's true, then I want to break out of my while loop. Otherwise, I'll be looping indefinitely. It's a bit messy, this syntax, isn't it? So if I reach this point, I know I've found a film. And what I might want to do is just print it out. I'll print out 2 things because I want to show you something. I'll print out the type of the film row, and I'll also print out the film row title. I run that program. Hopefully I haven't created an infinite loop. You can see that each row is of type pyodbc.row, and I've got the title of the film as well. Get rid of that. And what I want to do is stop at the 6th film. The 6th film is Pirates of the Caribbean. And once I've found a Pirates film, I don't think there's any need to carry on beyond that. So I'll put in a comment to that effect. So to do this, I'll create a variable to hold the film name, film title, and I'll set that to equal the title of the film. And if the film title contains the word pirates, I need to make sure I'm turning it to lowercase, but you can see when I type $lower in, it's not recognizing it as a string, despite the fact if I were to print out the type of this, even though it says any there, it would actually say it was a string. To force IntelliSense, I need to convert it to a string formally, and then I'll be able to convert it to lowercase. And what I want to do is say if the word pirates lies within that. And to do that, I can use this unusual syntax, saying if one string of text lies within the other. And if that's true, I want to break. I don't want to print any more films. So this time I should see the first 6 films, I think, up to and including the pirates. At least I will do if I actually print it out. So I just need to add on a print statement. And I'll print out the film title. Let's try that one again. So I'll see the first 6 films. It will stop as soon as it reaches a Pirates film. So that really illustrates the advantage of using fetch1. It allows you to fetch one row at a time. But otherwise, fetch all seems an easy option to me, because then it allows you just to loop over all the rows in a single command. And I don't like this messy syntax with while, true, and break, and I'm always terrified I'm going to create an infinite loop. So we've looked at how to select data. What I want to do now is look at how to insert, update, or delete it. So that's running either an insert into statement or an update statement or a delete statement in SQL. So I've got my basics of running a query like that. And what it does is create a connection. I need to import my pyodbc module in a second to get rid of that error message. Creates a cursor. and then it executes an SQL statement, which I need to put in the variable called SQL, and then closes a connection. Now, between running the SQL statement and closing the connection, it can do one of two things. It can either return the rows of data using fetch one, fetch many, or fetch all, or it can commit the action to actually make your change. And the reason I've listed the statements like this is what we're going to do is not only learn how to insert, update, or delete data, but how to write a generic function which will handle both scenarios, which I think will be useful going forward. So to do this, let's turn this into a function. And what I'll do is call it run query. And it will take two arguments. The first argument is a query I want to run, which will be contained in the variable called SQL and will be of data type str. And the second argument will be whether it's an action query or not. So I'll call that if underscore action, and that will be a Boolean. So if that's true, then it's an insert, update, or delete statement, and if it's false, it's just returning data. The whole thing will return a list of data. Although if it's an action query, that list will be set to none because there's nothing to return. Now I'm going to make one more change to this. I'm going to put a star comma there. And I don't know if you remember from the section on functions earlier, or the tutorial on functions earlier, what that means is when you're calling this function, you need to specify the name for the second argument because people really need to understand the difference between the two possibilities. So what I can then do is just indent everything within this to make it syntactically correct and import the PyODBC module at the top. So what I now need to do is change these comments to make it work under all possible circumstances. And there's two. It's either an action query or it isn't. So just get rid of the do something here bit, but keep everything else the same. What we can do now is say if it's an action query, we want to do is two things. We want to actually commit the query we've just run with this statement. So commit the changes to the database and then make sure that we return something from the function. So to commit the query is very simple. You just say CSR, which is a cursor, .commit. And that's basically writing the changes to the database. If you omit that statement, it will run successfully, but won't actually make any underlying changes to the database. Very easy mistake to make. And the second thing we need to do is make sure that this returns something. Otherwise, you'll get a syntax error. It says it's returning a list, but none, it just means it will return basically a blank list or an empty list or non-existent list, actually. Otherwise, if it's a normal query, then what I need to do is return the set of data. So what I'll do is create a generic variable called table. I'll set that equal to the fetchAll method applied to the cursor. So I'll get all the records and I'll return my table. So, and you'll notice I've written it like this so that under all possible circumstances it closes a connection. Actually, it's doing that too late. So what I need to do is make sure that I do that in either possible case within here. Now there's other ways to do this. I don't think I've chosen a particularly elegant one. But that will make sure the connection is always closed, which is important. So now I've got my function, I can call it under two possible circumstances. One is to make my change to my data, and the other is to actually list the data out. Let's start by listing the data out. So to do this, what I can do is run my function and store the result returned in a variable which I'll call films. Pass in my two arguments. The first one will be a valid select statement, so I'll select everything from the table called TBL film, and I'll title. And the second argument, I will have to put if action equals. That's what that star means. If I'd miss that out, I'll get a syntax error saying I haven't provided, or rather I provided too many positional arguments. So this isn't an action query because it's just selecting data. And what I can then do is list out all these films, and I'll just print out, to keep things really nice and simple, the title of the film and how many Oscars it won. I think Should work. So let's try running that without any modifications. And you can see it gives me the list of films. It looks horrible as a floating point number. Oscars is actually stored in the database as a floating point number. So I'll just convert that to an integer and run it again. That's a bit better. So you can see I've got B-movie winning 11 Oscars. That's because I made a change in the database. That can't be right. Any film in which relies as a plot line on an insect falling in love with a woman cannot be true. So we'll change that to just 1 Oscar, although the true figure is actually 0. So to do that, what I'm going to do is before running this, I'm going to call another version of run query to reduce the B-movie Oscars. Do this, there's no point setting a variable to hold the return of it because we know it returns none. So I can just run a select statement and I can say update the films table, set the Oscars equal 1 when title equals, and I need to put this in inverted commas to make it work in SQL, equals B-movie. I then need to specify the second argument, which is that this is an action query. So I'm hoping when I run this entire program that what it will do is firstly call my function to make a change. So it will run the commit statement to write my change to the database. And the second time I run it, it will show me the results. Let's see if it works. And there we are, B-movie's gone down to 1. And that's pretty much everything you need to do to work with SQL Server data in Python, apart possibly from running stored procedures, which is what we'll look at in the final part of this tutorial. So I've created a stored procedure called list films. And what it does is it lists out all the films which either begin with a given letter, and I've defaulted that to an empty string to make sure that if I miss it out, I'll get everything, or which have won at least a minimum number of Oscars. And again, I've set a default for 0 for that to make sure that if I miss it out, I get everything. And I've used create or alter because I was so fed up of having to create it and then wonder whether it already existed and changing that to alter. So what this stored procedure does is list out all the films, as I say, where this criteria is true, so where the film title begins with a given letter, and where this criteria is true, i.e. that it's won at least a given number of Oscars. And then I test it out with 3 different statements, one to list out all the films, one to list all the ones winning at least 1 Oscar, and one to list all the ones beginning with T, which have won at least 0 Oscars. And if I run that by pressing the execute key or pressing F5, you'll see I get 10 films in the first command, 3 films which have won at least 1 Oscar, and 2 which begin with the letter T. So that's the stored procedure I want to run. It's called list films, and the 2 parameters are called film prefix and min Oscars. So what I can do now is go to Visual Studio. I've actually included this, by the way, as a file with the tutorial, so you can copy that in if you want. And what I'm now going to do is add to a program I've already created called running a stored procedure.py. It's got the bare bones of creating a connection and a cursor. And what I'm going to do is extend that now so it runs my stored procedure. That I will create 2 variables. First one I'll call my SQL command. And I'll set this to be the command I want to run. I want to execute my stored procedure. It's not case sensitive, but I'm typing it in like this because this is the standard convention in SQL. And it takes 2 parameters. So what I'm going to do is put a placeholder in for each of them, and I'll have to fill in that placeholder with values. So notice it's not using the names of the parameters, it's using their position. My second variable I'll call values. I'll set this to be a tuple. And the tuple will contain the 2 values I'm passing in. So let's set the first one to be T. Sensitive, so I don't really quite know why I'm changing that. And the second one to be 0. What I can then do is execute my command, run my stored procedure. And to do that, I can take my cursor, execute it, and provide two things. One is my SQL command, and you can see the second argument is waiting for is the parameters. So if I specify that to be my values. So what happens now will depend on what type of stored procedure it was. If it was an action query, then what I would do is say csr.commit to commit my changes. But this isn't, so I'm going to miss that out. So instead, I want to actually get the results returned. So what I'll do is create a variable called films, and I will set that equal to the results of running my stored procedure. So it will be csr.fetchAll to get all the records back. I'll print that out without any extra formatting, so that's going to look slightly peculiar, but at least we'll show it's worked. And finally, I mustn't forget to close my connection. Important always. And that's how you can run a stored procedure. So if I try running this now, I should see two films, because if you remember, there are two films which began with a T and which had won at least 0 Oscars. From memory, they were The Bourne Ultimatum and Transformers. How could I forget that? And The Bourne Ultimatum had won 3 Oscars and Transformers had won 0. So if I change this number to 1, it should just show one film. And there it is. And that's pretty much everything you need to know to get data from SQL Server.